Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a letter somewhere in your home this evening, unopened, or perhaps long filed away, whose contents once carried more weight than anyone acknowledged? Old paper holds old truths. Watson knew this well, that what a family chooses to seal away reveals as much as what it sets freely on the record. Do subscribe so no dispatch goes unexamined. Now, settle quietly, for a sealed document, as reason teaches, is never truly silent. You will find our Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. Chapter 1. The House of Wycliffe Grange. There are families in England whose greatest inheritance is not land nor money, nor the accumulation of centuries, but something altogether more fragile, the careful, almost devotional preservation of a name. I have observed in the course of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that it is precisely such families who attract the most peculiar and most dangerous forms of human mischief. Where wealth alone is at stake, greed operates in the open, swift, and comprehensible. But where reputation is the treasure, the crimes committed in its defence move quietly, dressed in the respectable garments of duty and discretion, and are none the less ruinous for their silence. It was on a wet Thursday evening in early March that the matter of Wycliffe Grange first presented itself to us in Baker Street. Holmes had spent the greater part of the day in a condition of restless abstraction, moving between his chemistry bench and his violin with the dissatisfied energy of a man whose mind has outpaced its available material. I had been reading by the fire, content in the steady rhythm of rain against the window, when Mrs. Hudson appeared to announce that a lady was below, who declined to give her name but had arrived in a private carriage, and bore, in the housekeeper's considered judgment, the unmistakable bearing of quality under strain. Holmes set down his bow and waved a hand with an expression of languid interest that I had long since learned to distinguish from genuine indifference. A moment later, our visitor entered. She was a woman of perhaps 55, dressed in deep grey, with the composed and careful movements of someone who has practised self-possession, under observation for a great many years. Her face was handsome in the severe manner of faded portraits, and her hands, though gloved, were held with a precision that suggested habit rather than ease. She introduced herself as Lady Eleanor Wycliffe, widow of Sir Reginald Wycliffe of Wycliffe Grange in Surrey, and she sat without ceremony in the chair Holmes indicated, as though she had long since ceased to require the performance of social comfort. I withdrew my notebook, which Holmes privately regards as an affectation and publicly tolerates, and I record here the substance of what she told us. Wycliffe Grange was an old estate of moderate extent, distinguished less by its acreage than by the unbroken continuity of the family name across several centuries of Surrey history. Sir Reginald, her late husband, had died 2 years previously, leaving matters in a condition of considerable legal complexity. His younger brother, now also deceased, had departed a contested settlement, and the question of who held lawful trusteeship over the estate's family archive, its deeds, correspondence, and entailed records, had been placed before the Chancery Division. A sealed dispatch from the court was expected within days, carried by special legal courier from London, and its contents would determine how the estate's administration was to proceed. Until the dispatch arrived and was formally opened, Lady Eleanor had retained sole custody of the muniment room, a locked chamber in the east wing of the house that contained all the family's documentary history. She was not, she said, a woman who mistrusted every shadow. But the household was not at peace, and she had reasons to fear that the dispatch's arrival might produce consequences she was not prepared to manage alone. Holmes, who had been watching her with the patient, cataloguing attention he reserves for those he considers genuinely worth studying, spoke, at last. "You have said nothing of what the dispatch is expected to contain, Lady Eleanor. I observe, however, that you are not frightened of what may be stolen. You are frightened of what may become known." She looked at him for a moment without surprise, which itself told me something. She had been warned, I suspected that directness was the currency of Baker Street. "The court has been examining old records," she said. "Marriage registers, baptismal entries, and a private settlement made by my husband's father some 30 years ago. There is a possibility, not yet confirmed, that certain irregularities in the family line may be formally acknowledged." "Irregularities of legitimacy," Holmes said. "Yes." She said nothing further on that point, and Holmes did not press her. Instead, he asked her to describe the household at Wycliffe Grange, and she did so with the measured precision of a woman recounting a situation she has rehearsed inwardly many times. Her late husband's nephew, Julian Wycliffe, resided at the Grange, a young man of agreeable manner and persistent financial embarrassment. There was also Miss Beatrice Vale, a distant relation who had been raised in the household after the death of her parents, educated and clothed at the family's expense, treated with every practical consideration, but never entirely absorbed into the family's identity. Arthur Wycliffe, Lady Eleanor's younger stepson, had recently returned from an extended period abroad, under circumstances that were vague in the telling and troubled in the telling. Mr. Edwin Preece, the family solicitor, was currently resident in the house to manage the legal formalities surrounding the dispatch, and there was Colonel Marlowe, an old friend of Sir Reginald's, a retired military man of considerable local standing, who had attached himself to the household in an advisory capacity following the baronet's death. Holmes asked very few questions during this account. He listened with the stillness he adopts when a matter has genuinely engaged him, his grey eyes moving once or twice to the window, where the rain continued its steady industry against the glass. When Lady Eleanor had finished, he said, "You have not told me what you wish me to do." "I wish you to come to Wycliffe Grange," she replied, "before the dispatch arrives, and to remain there until it has been properly opened and its consequences assessed. I cannot tell you precisely what I fear. But I know this household, Mr. Holmes. There are people within it who want very different things from this dispatch, and I am not confident that the arrival of a sealed document in a house full of competing interests will pass without incident." Holmes rose and stood by the fire for a moment, considering. Then he glanced at me with that slight, almost imperceptible quickening of expression that I had come to recognise over years of partnership as the sign that a problem had found its proper footing in his mind. "We shall come tomorrow," he said. "In the meantime, you will ensure that the muniment room remains locked, that the key does not leave your person, and that no member of the household is informed of our purpose beyond what you consider strictly necessary." Lady Eleanor rose, inclined her head, and departed with the same composed economy with which she had arrived. I heard the carriage wheels on the wet cobbles below a moment later, retreating toward the Strand. I set down my notebook and looked at Holmes, who had returned to the window. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "I make several things of it, Watson," he said, "and most of them are premature. But I note that she did not tell us who she suspects, which means either that she does not know, or that she's protecting someone. Either possibility is equally instructive." He paused. "She also arrived without consulting any of the family, which suggests that the person she fears may be among those closest to her." A distressing position. "All the more so," said Holmes quietly, turning from the window, "because she does not yet know what she stands to lose." I closed my notebook and listened to the rain. Chapter 2. The Sealed Room and the Expected Messenger. We departed Baker Street the following morning on the 9:15 from Waterloo, and I confess that the Surrey countryside, even under the lingering grey of early March, presented itself with a quiet relief after the compressed energies of London. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, his coat collar turned up, his fingers laced together in his lap, and said nothing for the better part of an hour. I had learned, in the years of our friendship, not to interpret his silences as vacancy. They were, rather, the outward expression of a mind arranging and rearranging its materials with the deliberate patience of a man sorting correspondence by an importance invisible to everyone else in the room. I occupied myself with the morning papers, which offered nothing of immediate consequence. The weather had broken slightly by the time we reached Dorking, and by the time the hired trap had conveyed us up the long gravel approach to Wycliffe Grange, there was even a pale provisional sun making its tentative appearance over the Surrey hills. The house itself was larger than I had expected and older. It was a stone-fronted Jacobean structure of considerable extent, its mullioned windows and age-darkened cornices giving it the settled authority of a building that has survived sufficient history to regard the present with measured indifference. The grounds were well kept, the hedges trimmed, the gravel raked. Whoever maintained Wycliffe Grange did so with conscientiousness, if not with obvious pleasure. Lady Eleanor received us in the entrance hall with the same composure she had maintained in Baker Street, though I noticed that her eyes moved fractionally to the corridor behind us as the butler closed the door, as though confirming that no one had overheard our arrival. She led us through to a sitting room on the ground floor where a fire had been laid, and set about introductions with the careful efficiency of a woman who has choreographed the morning's movements in advance. Julian Wycliffe appeared first, entering with the easy manner of someone accustomed to charming his way through difficult rooms. He was perhaps 30, fair-haired and well-dressed in the slightly overdone fashion of a man who has spent time cultivating an impression. His handshake was firm and his smile ready, but Holmes told me afterward that Julian's eyes had gone immediately to the briefcase I carried, then to Holmes's hands, then to his own, in that order, the instinct of a man who has been in rooms where documents matter and has not always been on comfortable ground in them. Miss Beatrice Vale was something altogether different. She was a slight, dark-haired woman of perhaps 28, possessed of a stillness that was not repose but containment. She greeted us with correct courtesy, and said almost nothing beyond what politeness required. It was not shyness, I thought. It was the practised economy of someone who has learned that words in a household such as this are never entirely without consequence. Arthur Wycliffe, who entered a few minutes later as though he had only just learned of our presence, was a man whose physical vigour sat at odds with something indefinably worn in his expression. He was perhaps 35, broad in the shoulder, tanned in the manner of the tropics rather than the Mediterranean, and he shook hands with a directness that suggested he had been in places where social performance was a luxury. He excused himself shortly afterward, claiming letters requiring attention, and Holmes watched him go without apparent remark. Mr. Edwin Preece arrived last, adjusting his spectacles with a small preparatory gesture as he sat down. He was a precise, dry-mannered man whose professional composure did not quite conceal a persistent, low-level anxiety that I recognised from my medical practice as the condition of someone who knows more than he feels comfortable knowing. He confirmed the facts Lady Eleanor had already provided. The dispatch was expected before the end of the week, the muniment room was secured, and the arrangements for its formal opening had been made. Colonel Marlowe, we were told, was out walking the grounds and would join the party at luncheon. Holmes asked to be shown the muniment room directly. It was situated at the far end of the east wing, accessible by a single door of age-darkened oak, banded with iron at its lower half, and by 2 windows on the exterior wall, each fitted with solid iron bars of the kind that appear in older houses, less for security than from an era when security and architecture were not yet separate considerations. Lady Eleanor produced the key, a heavy iron thing on a separate ring from the rest of her household keys, and admitted us. The room was not large. It contained 2 oak presses of considerable age, a central table, a chair, and a set of shelves on which deed boxes and labelled correspondence bundles were arranged, with the fastidious order of generations of family solicitors. It smelled of old paper and linseed oil, and there was about it the particular stillness of a room that has not been disturbed in some time and knows it. Holmes moved through the space without haste, his hands clasped behind his back. He examined the windows. He looked at the door's lock from both sides. He studied the floor near the cabinet on the interior wall, crouching briefly, then rose without comment. He glanced at the ceiling. He stood for a moment in the centre of the room with an air of complete inward absorption, then turned and walked out. In the corridor outside, the long case clock that stood opposite the muniment room door read 23 minutes past 11. I noted the time out of habit. Holmes noted it also, though for a different reason, one he did not share with me until later. At luncheon, I was able to observe the household together for the first time, and the impression it produced was one I find difficult to convey precisely. Because what was most notable was not any individual quality in the people present, but the quality of the space between them. Everyone was polite. The conversation moved across acceptable subjects. The weather, a piece of local news, the condition of the roads from London. But underneath the movement of words there was something taut and waiting, the atmosphere of a house that has been holding its breath for some time and has grown practised at concealing the effort. Colonel Marlowe, who joined us as promised, was a large, straight-backed man of perhaps 65 with close-cropped white hair and the deliberate manner of someone who has spent a long professional life making considered decisions. He spoke with authority and some charm, and it was apparent that the household accorded him a degree of informal precedence that had nothing to do with his formal position within it. He asked Holmes several questions about our journey and our London practice, and Holmes answered them pleasantly and without much content. I have seen him do this before, maintain a surface of agreeable vagueness, while directing his actual attention to precisely the things the room does not wish to be seen examining. What Holmes examined was this. The moment Marlowe sat down, his eyes went not to his host, not to his food, but to the door through which we had passed from the east corridor. It was a glance of half a second's duration, almost entirely concealed by the gesture of unfolding his napkin, and I should not have registered it myself had Holmes not pressed my arm beneath the table at precisely that instant. After the meal, as we walked in the garden before the afternoon light began to fail, I asked Holmes what had struck him most about the morning. He was quiet for a moment before answering. 3 things, Watson. The clock in the corridor outside the muniment room is running 7 minutes slow. The housemaid we passed on the east staircase on our way back altered her course to avoid the west staircase door entirely, though it would have been her more direct route. And Colonel Marlowe, when Priest mentioned the dispatch's expected wording, showed one instant of quite unmistakable relief before recasting his expression into concern. Holmes paused. The dispatch has not yet arrived. It is already causing damage. Chapter 3. The dispatch disappears. The courier arrived on Friday evening 2 hours later than expected. We had been waiting since 5:30. The household gathered in the drawing-room with varying degrees of manufactured composure. Lady Eleanor sat upright near the window, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that spoke of effort rather than calm. Julian Wycliffe stood by the mantelpiece, examining a small figurine with the concentration of a man who has no interest whatsoever in figurines. Miss Beatrice Vale read, or appeared to read, a book whose pages she did not turn for 40 minutes. Mr. Priest had arranged papers on the writing desk and periodically shuffled them without visible purpose. Arthur Wycliffe alone seemed genuinely at ease, or at least indifferent, seated in a wing chair with his long legs extended toward the fire and his attention fixed on some private middle distance. Colonel Marlowe did not sit. He stood near the door to the corridor, occasionally glancing toward the entrance hall, and twice made some remark about the roads, from London being treacherous in wet weather at this season. No one disagreed with him. Holmes had stationed himself in a corner chair with a copy of a county history he had found in the library, and to a casual observer he was reading it. He was not reading it. The knock at the front door, when it finally came, produced a stillness in the room that was almost theatrical. We heard Pierce, the butler, cross the entrance hall. We heard the bolts drawn, the brief exchange of low voices, the sound of the door closing again. Then Pierce appeared in the drawing-room doorway to announce that the courier had arrived, and Lady Eleanor rose with a composure so precisely maintained it might have been made of porcelain. She received the sealed packet in the entrance hall, in the presence of Mr. Priest, and, at Holmes's quiet suggestion, in the presence of Holmes and myself also. The courier was a spare, road-worn man of middle age named Gibbons, dressed in a heavy travelling coat, and bearing the particular expression of someone who has spent many hours alone in a vehicle, and has not entirely returned from the experience. He confirmed that the packet had been in his possession since its issue from the court offices that morning, tendered the relevant receipt for Lady Eleanor's signature, and accepted her counter-signature in return. Priest examined the seal with a small lens he produced from his breast pocket, confirmed it intact, and Lady Eleanor carried the packet directly to the muniment room. We accompanied her. She placed the sealed packet upon the central table, locked the room behind us, and retained the key. The clock in the corridor read 20 minutes past 7. I noted this deliberately, having been made attentive to that clock by Holmes's remark 2 days prior. The minute hand was, as before, 7 minutes behind the correct time by my pocket watch. Dinner that evening was an altered affair. The arrival of the dispatch seemed to have released some constraint on the household surface behaviour, so that conversation became, if anything, more animated than before, with a brittle quality of relief that has not yet confirmed itself as permanent. Julian was charming and slightly too loud. Colonel Marlowe proposed a toast to the memory of Sir Reginald, which was received with dutiful solemnity. Holmes accepted a second helping of the soup and said almost nothing, which in my experience is a reliable indicator that his mind is in full employment. I retired at 10:30. Holmes, I noticed, did not retire at all, though I did not learn this until the following morning. What woke me was not a sound precisely, but the absence of the particular quality of silence that settles on an old house when its inhabitants are all at rest. I had been in enough troubled households to recognise the difference. I lay still for a moment, then heard what I had half expected, a door somewhere in the east wing closing with the careful deliberateness of someone who does not wish to be heard. I dressed and went into the corridor. There was no one visible. The lamp at the end of the passage cast its usual orange light across the floorboards. I walked toward the east wing, and at the junction of the main corridor with the passage leading to the muniment room, I nearly collided with Lady Eleanor herself. She was in her dressing gown, pale as paper, leaning against the wall beside the muniment room door with one hand pressed flat to the panelling as though she required its support. The key ring was in her other hand. The muniment room door was closed. "Mrs. Hudson," she said, which made no sense at all, and then she collected herself and said, "Dr. Watson, I came down. I do not know why. I simply felt I ought to come down." She had found herself unable to sleep, and yielding to an unease she could not name, had come to satisfy herself that the muniment room was undisturbed. She had not opened it. She had simply felt unwell in the corridor and remained there until I appeared. I called for Holmes, who materialised from the shadow of the library doorway at the far end of the passage with a promptness that confirmed my suspicion about his night's activities. Together we persuaded Lady Eleanor to sit, and when she had recovered something of her colour, Holmes took the key from her, unlocked the muniment room, and we went in. The packet lay on the table exactly where Lady Eleanor had placed it. The seal appeared whole. Holmes bent over it for a long moment, then straightened without touching it, and asked Lady Eleanor whether anyone other than herself had a key to this room. She said with complete certainty that no one did. Holmes said nothing further that night. He helped me settle Lady Eleanor in the care of her lady's maid, then returned to the library and remained there until dawn, at which point I found him seated beside a dead fire, with the county history open across his knees, and his pipe gone cold in his hand. The morning's discovery was made at 8 o'clock, assembled at Lady Eleanor's instruction in the muniment room, with priest present as legal witness. The household watched as the sealed packet was opened. Priest cut the cord. Lady Eleanor broke the seal. The outer wrapping fell away. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, blank on both faces, bearing a single impression at its upper right corner. The red wax stamp of the Chancery Division, applied with care, but applied to something that was not the document it claimed to authenticate. The true dispatch had been replaced. The silence in the room had different textures. Priest made a small sound of professional dismay. Julian went quite still. Beatrice Vale's face when I looked at her was flushed with a sudden anger that she brought under control before anyone else appeared to notice it. Colonel Marlowe said in a measured voice that this was an outrage, and that the police must be sent for immediately. Holmes, standing at the far end of the table, was watching the room rather than the packet. He said nothing. Inspector Lestrade arrived from London on the midday train, accompanied by a constable and his customary expression of energetic confidence in whichever theory he had already formed. He had formed one on the train. It emerged. Julian Wycliffe's debts were known to the local solicitor's office, and a man with creditors at his door and an inheritance decision pending had, in Lestrade's view, a motive that wanted very little further examination. Lestrade put his theory to Holmes over cold meat and bread in the kitchen passage, where they could speak without the household overhearing. Holmes listened politely. When Lestrade had finished, he said, "It is a good theory, Lestrade. It fits the obvious facts with admirable economy." "Well then," said Lestrade. "The obvious facts," said Holmes, "are precisely the ones I distrust." He set down his cup. "Tell me, what time did the courier say he was delayed?" "Bad roads near Dorking. He left London later than scheduled." "Near Dorking," Holmes repeated very quietly, as though filing the remark in a place he intended to return to. "Yes. Thank you, Lestrade." He excused himself and went back upstairs, and I followed him, and when we were alone in the passage he paused at the corridor clock and looked at it for a long moment. 7 minutes slow, he said. Still. What does it signify? He turned to me with the particular expression he wears when a question has answered itself to his satisfaction, but he is not yet prepared to share the answer. "It signifies," he said, "that someone in this house is keeping a different kind of time from the rest of us." Chapter 4. Altered Schedules and Withheld Truths. There is a particular kind of investigation that proceeds not by the accumulation of dramatic evidence, but by the patient correction of small wrongnesses, the kind of inquiry that resembles, more than anything, the work of a restorer who scrapes back layers of overpainting to find what was originally there. Holmes had been in that mode since the previous evening, and by Saturday morning he had adopted the systematic stillness of a man who knows that the truth is present in the room and requires only the right angle of a light to become visible. Lestrade spent the morning conducting interviews in the formal manner he favoured, seated behind the writing desk in the library with his constable at his elbow, and each member of the household brought in successively, as though the drawing-room of a Surrey estate were an extension of Scotland Yard. I sat in on 2 of these exchanges at Holmes's request, my role being, as he put it, to watch the faces while Lestrade watches the words. Holmes himself moved through the house. I found him, at one point in the kitchen passage, in conversation with the cook, a broad Devonshire woman named Mrs. Endell, who regarded both Holmes and the entire situation with the same practical, unsentimental attention she would have directed at a piece of meat whose freshness was in question. She confirmed, in response to Holmes's unhurried questions, that dinner on Thursday evening had been called 30 minutes later than usual. The instruction had come from Pierce, the butler, and Pierce had received it from Lady Eleanor. The servants had been released to their quarters earlier than was customary, before 10 o'clock, on the grounds that the household was expecting the dispatch and preferred to wait privately. Holmes thanked Mrs. Endell and walked back through the corridor toward the east wing. I fell into step beside him. "The schedule was altered from above," I said. "It was altered," Holmes agreed, "and with sufficient authority that no one questioned it. Whether it was altered by design or by coincidence is what interests me. They are not the same thing, Watson, even when they produce the same result." He stopped at the entrance to the west staircase, a secondary flight of stone steps that ran between the kitchen level and the first floor, used primarily by the housemaids and the footmen. The door at its foot bore the slight discoloration around its latch of a door used often. Holmes opened it, examined the step immediately beyond, and crouched. On the 3rd step, pressed into the slight accumulation of dust along the outer edge where the stair met the wall, was the unmistakable ghost of a candle drip, hardened to a small white disc, with a faint trail extending perhaps 6 inches down the riser below it, indicating that the candle had been carried in motion rather than set down. "After the servants retired," Holmes said, straightening. "The timing is consistent with 11 o'clock or later, given the dust settlement around the wax. Not a servant's errand. They would have used a lamp. Arthur Wycliffe claimed to be writing letters, I said. He did. No letters were posted yesterday, nor have any been placed in the hall tray for the morning collection. Holmes closed the staircase door gently. Mr. Priest told Lestrade he retired at 10. Yet the wax is above the servant level of the house, and below the guest level, which means the west staircase was used by someone moving between them. We returned to the muniment room, which Lestrade had placed under the nominal guard of his constable, an arrangement Holmes rendered academic by producing from his pocket a small folded paper that he presented to the constable with the quiet authority of a man who carries the implicit permission of people the constable would not think to contradict. The constable stood aside. Inside, Holmes went directly to the interior cabinet, the tall oak press standing against the wall opposite the windows. He did not open it. Instead, he knelt and examined the floorboards before it, then the lower edge of the cabinet door, then rose and looked at the arrangement of deed boxes on the shelves with an expression of close, unhurried attention. "The dust on this floor," he said without looking at me, "has been disturbed here and not there. Someone stood in front of this cabinet. The scuff pattern is narrow, consistent with a single pair of feet, and the disturbance is recent, probably within the last week." He moved to the window. "Not here, not near the door, here, at the cabinet." He turned. Whatever they were looking for was not in the dispatch packet at all, or they did not believe it was. I considered this. Then the substitution of the packet may have been a secondary action, or a concealing one. The question is whether the person who searched this cabinet is the same person who intercepted the dispatch, or a different person altogether with a different interest in the room's contents. He produced his lens and applied it briefly to the lock of the interior cabinet. "This lock has been worked recently with something other than its own key. The scratching is fresh." He put the lens away. "Someone has been in here before, Watson, before we arrived, before the dispatch was due." At luncheon, Lestrade presented his working conclusions to Holmes over a private tray in the morning room, where the fire had been recently laid and the windows ran with the remnant of the morning's rain. Julian Wycliffe, Lestrade reported, had borrowed against his expected inheritance at 2 separate establishments in the preceding month. A pawnbroker in Holborn had confirmed that Julian had pledged a small miniature portrait. His creditors were pressing. The case was, in Lestrade's view, of satisfying clarity. Holmes ate his bread and said, "And the courier? What more have you established about his delay?" He told us himself. Bad roads near Dorking. "Has anyone spoken to him this morning?" Lestrade paused. "He returned to London last evening. Routine for a dispatch courier." "Quite," said Holmes. Then, in a different tone, more as a private remark than as a contribution to the conversation, "Greed, Lestrade, is usually in a hurry. It produces mistakes of haste, plans that are almost right, substitutions that are almost convincing. This substitution is better than almost convincing. The forged court stamp is, by all accounts, excellent. A skilled forger. Or a patient one. And patience," Holmes said, folding his napkin, "is not, in my experience, the temperament of a young man with creditors at the door." He excused himself after the meal and spent the better part of the afternoon in the library, examining a collection of Surrey County maps that he had asked Pierce to locate from the estate's shelves. I left him to it, and took a turn around the garden in the pale afternoon light, where I encountered Miss Beatrice Vale walking along the yew hedge with her arms folded, and her expression suggesting that the garden was providing her with considerably less comfort than she had sought in it. She acknowledged me with a nod, and we walked for a moment in the companionable silence of two people who find themselves temporarily on the same side of a closed door. "You were not surprised," I said after a time, "when the packet was opened yesterday?" She considered this with a seriousness that I found, in retrospect, more revealing than any denial would have been. "I was surprised that it had been done so neatly," she said. "I was not surprised that someone had done something." She did not elaborate, and I did not press her. We parted at the garden door, and I carried her words back to Holmes, who received them in silence, turned them over once as though weighing them, and then looked up from his maps. "She was angry," I said. "When the packet was opened. Angry, not frightened." "Yes," said Holmes. "There is a significant difference between a person who is afraid of what has been stolen and a person who is furious that someone else has stolen it first." He returned his attention to the map before him, his finger tracing a road south of Dorking toward the edge of the county. "Interesting," he said, very quietly to himself rather than to me. I looked over his shoulder. The road his finger rested on did not go anywhere near Dorking at all. Chapter 5. The Family History Behind the Dispatch. Mr. Edwin Preece was not, by nature, a man who volunteered information. He was the product of a professional tradition that regards discretion as the highest of the legal virtues, and in the ordinary course of his practice this quality served him admirably. But there are moments when discretion becomes its own form of danger, when the withholding of a relevant fact allows a worse fact to establish itself in its place, and I observed during Holmes's interview with the solicitor on Saturday afternoon the precise moment at which Preece understood this and decided with visible reluctance to revise his position. Holmes had asked to speak with him alone in the morning room, and I had been invited to remain on the grounds that, as Holmes put it to Preece with complete straightforwardness, Dr. Watson's presence tends to encourage candour in people who might otherwise find the conversation somewhat more adversarial. Preece accepted this with a thin smile and sat down, arranging his coat with the reflexive precision of a man whose composure is, in part, a professional costume. For the first quarter of an hour, Holmes asked questions of no apparent consequence. The structure of Sir Reginald's will, the general terms of the contested settlement, the procedural timeline of the court's review. Preece answered each with correct economy, offering nothing beyond what was asked. He was, I noted, the kind of witness who does not lie, but chooses his truths with considerable care. Then Holmes leaned forward slightly and said, in a tone from which all formality had been removed, "Mr. Preece, what did the court actually find?" Preece looked at him for a long moment. The clock on the mantelpiece counted 4 seconds. "The court," Preece said at last, "has examined the marriage register of St. Bride's, Fleet Street, for the year 1858. It has also examined baptismal records from a parish in Liège in Belgium, and a private deed of settlement executed in 1861 by the late Sir Edmund Wycliffe, Sir Reginald's father. And what do these records taken together establish?" Preece removed his spectacles and polished them with the slow deliberateness of a man assembling his courage rather than cleaning his lenses. "They establish with a degree of legal certainty that the court considers sufficient that Sir Edmund Wycliffe contracted a lawful marriage in 1857, prior to his publicly acknowledged union, and that a daughter was born of that first marriage the following year." He replaced his spectacles. That daughter was subsequently raised in England under a different name, following the death of her mother. Her connection to the Wycliffe family was concealed by deed and by the alteration of a parish record, an alteration which the court's examiner has now identified. The room was very quiet. Through the window I could see the yew hedge and the pale rectangle of March sky above it. "The daughter," Holmes said, "is now an adult woman," Preece said carefully, "resident in this household." I set down my pen. "Beatrice Vale." Preece inclined his head with the expression of a man who is relieved to have the word spoken by someone else. Holmes sat back. He did not appear surprised, which meant I knew that the possibility had already arranged itself in his thinking, though he had not seen fit to share it with me. He asked Preece how long he had known, and Preece said that he had suspected for some years but had not possessed documentary confirmation until the court's preliminary communication arrived 3 weeks ago. "And Lady Eleanor?" Holmes asked. "Lady Eleanor has known, or strongly suspected, for longer than I have. Sir Reginald told her something of it before his death, I believe, though not the full extent. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man of his era, and the correction of such a thing during his own lifetime was more than he could bring himself to undertake. While others," Holmes said, "have found the correction rather more alarming as a prospect." Preece made no direct answer to this, which was itself a kind of answer. After Priest had gone, Holmes stood at the window for some minutes without speaking. I waited, accustomed to the rhythm of these intervals, aware that what followed them was generally worth attending to. "Consider the geometry of motive," Holmes said at last, turning from the window. "Julian fears poverty. The dispatch's confirmation that Beatrice is a legitimate Wycliffe does not necessarily destroy his own position entirely, but it weakens it, and a weakened position is anathema to a man who is already under water financially." He moved to the fireplace. "Arthur fears exposure of his time abroad, but his shame is personal and recent and entirely unconnected to the family's old secret. Beatrice herself stands to gain enormously from the dispatch's contents, which removes her from suspicion in the ordinary sense, though it does not remove her from the situation." "She would not intercept a document that confirmed her own rights," I agreed. "She would not. Unless she knew that someone else intended to destroy it and acted to prevent them, which would explain the anger but not the method." He shook his head. "No, Beatrice Vale did not take the dispatch, but she may know more about its disappearance than she has said." He picked up his pipe from the mantelpiece and examined it without lighting it. "And then there is Lady Eleanor, who has known for years and has done nothing, and Colonel Marlowe, who has known for God knows how long and has done something." "You're still certain of Marlowe?" "I am certain that Marlowe showed relief when the forged packet appeared to satisfy the room, and that relief is not the emotion of an innocent bystander. I am certain that the road he used to reach this house from his own property, which lies some 4 miles southwest, passes within half a mile of the route a courier from London would take if diverted away from the Dorking road." Holmes finally applied a match to his pipe. "I am certain that the phrase Lestrade reported from the courier, the man's explanation that he had been urged toward caution for the dignity of the house, is the kind of phrase that belongs to a particular generation and a particular cast of mind. It is not a phrase a young man uses, Watson. It is the language of someone who has spent 60 years believing that honour is a matter of architecture." I thought of Marlowe at the luncheon table, straight-backed and deliberate, the white of his close-cropped hair against the dark panelling, the small, swift glance he had directed at the east corridor door. "He acted to protect the family name," I said. "He acted to protect his idea of the family name," Holmes said, "which is a rather different thing, and considerably more dangerous because an idea cannot be satisfied by evidence." He moved to the writing table and drew toward him the Surrey map he had been consulting the previous afternoon. His finger found the same road south of Dorking, and followed it a short distance to a property marked with the initials of its owner in the careful hand of the cartographer. "Tomorrow morning," Holmes said, "I should very much like to speak with someone who has visited that address recently and is still, I suspect, in the neighbourhood." He tapped the map once. "The courier, Lestrade tells us, returned to London. I wonder." I came round the table to look at the property his finger indicated. It was a small lodge, marked with the letters CM set back from the road behind a half-circle of indicated woodland. Colonel Marlowe's lodge. "You believe the courier is still there?" I said. Holmes drew on his pipe and regarded the map with the settled expression of someone who has been following a thread in the dark and has now, at last, felt it go taut. "I believe," he said, "that a man who is given careful instructions and a sufficient reason to follow them does not simply vanish back to London when the matter he was party to begins to attract the attention of Scotland Yard. I believe he is somewhere he was told he would be safe." He folded the map. "And I believe that Colonel Marlowe, for all his talk of dignity and duty, didn't consider with sufficient care what becomes of the people he uses as instruments when a better craftsman arrives to examine the work." Outside, the last of the afternoon light was failing over the yew hedge. Somewhere in the upper part of the house a door opened and closed, and the sound carried down through the old boards with the particular intimacy of a building in which sound has nowhere to go but inward. Chapter 6. Alliances in the Drawing Room. Sunday at Wycliffe Grange had the quality of a held breath. The household attended the local church in the morning, at Lady Eleanor's insistence, with the collective discipline of people who understand that the maintenance of ordinary appearance is, in troubled times, its own form of work. Holmes and I did not accompany them. Holmes used the hour of their absence to conduct a second examination of the muniment room, and I used it to sit by the library fire and collect my thoughts, which had by this point accumulated to a degree that required some organising. What I knew set plainly. A court dispatch establishing Beatrice Vale as a legitimate Wycliffe had been intercepted before it reached the house and replaced with a forgery. The substitution had been executed with a patience and a technical precision inconsistent with Julian Wycliffe's particular form of desperation. Colonel Marlowe had a property near the diverted road. The courier had claimed delay but carried evidence of a different journey on his boots. And Marlowe, throughout, had asked not who had stolen the dispatch but only whether its contents could yet be made public. What I did not know was the precise mechanism of the interception, the question of who within the household, if anyone, had assisted Marlowe, and what had become of the true dispatch itself. Holmes had not yet told me everything he suspected. This was not unusual, and I had long since ceased to take it as a personal slight. He withholds in the middle stages of a case, not from any wish to be theatrical, but because he has observed that speaking a half-formed conclusion aloud has a tendency to calcify it before the evidence has finished arranging itself. He prefers to keep his reasoning in motion for as long as the facts permit. The household returned from church shortly before noon, and it was in the early afternoon, while Lestrade occupied himself upstairs with a second review of Julian's room, that Holmes conducted the interviews that would later prove to have been the pivot of the entire investigation. He spoke with Beatrice Vale first in the small sitting room off the main hall, a room used principally by the household's women and carrying the particular atmosphere of a space in which private conversations have always been conducted. I sat to one side. Beatrice entered with the same contained composure I had observed in the garden the previous day, sat without being invited to do so, and looked at Holmes with an attention that was neither hostile nor particularly welcoming, simply direct. Holmes opened without preamble. "Miss Vale, I am aware of what the dispatch contains. I am telling you this not to distress you, but because it makes concealment between us unnecessary, and I find that unnecessary concealment wastes time that might be better applied." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, not relief exactly, but the release of a particular tension. The tension of waiting for a thing to be said that one has been carrying alone for some time. "Priest told you," she said. "Priest confirmed what I had inferred. When did you yourself become certain?" She was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago. I found a letter among some papers Lady Eleanor had left carelessly in the morning room. It was from my mother's sister, written years earlier, and it contained sufficient detail for me to understand what my position in this family actually was. She paused. "What it actually should have been. And you said nothing. To whom would I have said it? This is not a household in which such a conversation is easily begun." There was no self-pity in her voice. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the weariness of someone who has made peace with a difficult truth about the people around her. "Lady Eleanor has always treated me with every practical kindness, but kindness and justice are not the same provision, and I was old enough by the time I understood to know the difference." Holmes asked whether she had told anyone of her discovery. She said she had not. He asked whether she had ever attempted to access the muniment room or its contents independently, and she met this question without flinching. "I looked at the lock once," she said. "I did not open it. I decided that I would wait for the court to speak, because a truth confirmed by law cannot be argued away by anyone's preference." Holmes thanked her, and she left, and the room seemed slightly larger after she'd gone, in the way that rooms do when the person who has departed was carrying more than their visible weight. Arthur Wycliffe presented an altogether different character. He came in with the slightly over-casual bearing of a man prepared to be suspected of something, and resigned to it, settled into the chair across from Holmes, and offered his history with a rueful brevity that was, I thought, genuinely rather than performatively honest. His years abroad had involved investment in a Cape Town trading concern that had failed spectacularly. a private engagement to a woman whose family had ultimately refused consent, and the accumulation of debts that he had spent the intervening period quietly reducing. None of it, he acknowledged, reflected well on his judgment. None of it, Holmes confirmed to me afterward, had any bearing whatsoever on the matter at hand. Colonel Marlowe came last, and he came already armoured. He sat with the upright ease of a man who has occupied difficult chairs in more difficult rooms than this one, and he met Holmes's gaze with the settled, almost philosophical composure of someone who has decided in advance that candour and forthrightness, carefully calibrated, are the better tactics. He spoke of his long friendship with Sir Reginald. He spoke of his regard for Lady Eleanor. He spoke at some length about the nature of honour in families of standing, the weight of old names, the particular cruelty of historical truths that, dragged into the present light, serve no purpose beyond the infliction of pain on people who bear no personal responsibility for the original acts. Holmes listened to all of this with the patient courtesy he sometimes deploys as a kind of camouflage, and when Marlowe had finished, Holmes said only, "Have you ever visited your lodge at Hartwell, Colonel, during the past fortnight?" A pause, so brief it might have escaped a less attentive observer. "I go there occasionally," Marlowe said. "It is a useful retreat." "Quite so," Holmes said. "And do you find that visitors often call upon you there?" "Rarely." The word was placed with a deliberateness that was itself informative. "It is rather off the beaten track." "Off the beaten track," Holmes repeated pleasantly. "Yes, I imagine it is." He asked nothing further, and Marlowe left with the same controlled assurance with which he had arrived. But at the door he paused, and without turning said to the room rather than to either of us, "There are situations, Mr. Holmes, in which the law and right conduct do not move in the same direction. I have always believed that a man of conscience must know which to follow." The door closed. I looked at Holmes. "He was warning you?" "He was explaining himself," Holmes said, and there was in his tone something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity, but occupied the difficult ground between them. "He has, in his own estimation, acted from principle. He believes this sincerely." Holmes rose and moved to the window. "That is what makes him more dangerous than a man who knows he has done wrong. A man who knows he has sinned can be made to feel it. A man who believes he has done right can only be proved mistaken, and the proving is considerably harder work." He was quiet for a moment, watching the yew hedge in the grey afternoon light. "Watson," he said at last, "I think we are past the stage of inference. Tomorrow we must act." "The lodge," I said. "The lodge, and the courier, if he is where I believe him to be." He turned from the window. "I should also like, before we go, to speak with Lady Eleanor alone. There is an alliance between her and Marlowe that she has not described to us honestly, and I suspect that what she has withheld is not guilt, but something almost worse." "What is worse than guilt?" Holmes looked at me with an expression that I had seen before on his face, in those cases where the human element in a crime exceeded the merely criminal. "Gratitude," he said, "to the wrong person." Chapter 7. The False Trail of Julian's Debts. The morning brought rain again, and with it Lestrade, who descended to breakfast with the expression of a man who has spent the night productively, and wishes this to be known. He had been busy. Through channels he declined to specify with any precision, he had obtained a fuller account of Julian Wycliffe's financial history, and it was a history that did not reflect well on its subject. 2 tailors in St. James's were owed significant sums. A gaming debt, some months old, had been transferred from one creditor to another in the manner that suggests a chain of increasingly uncomfortable negotiations. The pawnbroker in Holborn had confirmed his earlier statement in writing. And most damningly, Lestrade had that morning discovered in Julian's room, tucked between the pages of a racing almanac, a torn envelope bearing along its inner flap a thin residue of red wax of a type consistent with the court seal used on the dispatch packet. He placed this last item on the breakfast table with the quiet satisfaction of a man laying down a strong card, and watched Holmes examine it. Holmes held the envelope by its edges and looked at it for rather longer than Lestrade expected, his face giving away nothing of what he was reading in it. Then he set it down, returned to his coffee, and said, "Where was it in the room?" "Between pages 40 and 41 of the almanac on the nightstand." "The nightstand," Holmes said, "not the writing desk. Does it matter where a man keeps his almanac?" "It matters considerably where a man conceals evidence of a crime he has committed," Holmes said. "A guilty man does not keep incriminating material in the room where he sleeps, on the table beside his bed, between pages that correspond to nothing in particular. A guilty man either destroys such evidence or places it where it would not easily be found. This envelope has been placed where it would easily be found, which suggests it was placed there by someone who wished it to be found, and who knew that the room would be searched." He looked at Lestrade. By whom was the room searched, and when? Lestrade said that he had conducted the search himself yesterday afternoon. "And who knew you intended to conduct it?" A pause. "I mentioned it at luncheon. Generally. To the room." "To the room," Holmes repeated without inflection. "Yes." He set down his coffee cup. "The envelope is real evidence, Lestrade, but not of Julian Wycliffe's guilt. It is evidence of someone else's willingness to manufacture the appearance of it." Lestrade received this with the expression he habitually wore when Holmes departed from his conclusions, a mixture of professional scepticism and personal reluctance that I had observed enough times to find almost affectionate. He said that he would keep an open mind, in the tone of a man who intends to do nothing of the sort, and withdrew to write a report. The morning's other development arrived before 10 o'clock, in the form of Julian Wycliffe himself, who appeared at the door of the morning room where Holmes and I had retired, and who looked, in the frank light of a grey Monday, rather worse than he had on any previous day. The charm that had characterized his surface manner on our arrival had undergone a visible erosion. What remained was something more honest and considerably less comfortable. A young man who understood that circumstances were arranging themselves against him and did not know how to stop them. He sat down without being asked, which was itself a departure from his earlier manner, and addressed himself to Holmes with a directness that appeared to cost him something. "I know what Lestrade has found," he said. "Mrs. Pearce told my man, and my man told me. I want you to understand that I did not put that envelope there." "I know you did not," Holmes said. Julian looked at him. "You believe me?" "I have believed you since Thursday evening, when I observed that your reaction to the false packet was that of a man frightened of being suspected, rather than a man frightened of being caught. The distinction is not subtle, but it requires a certain quality of attention to register it." Holmes studied him for a moment. "What I should like you to tell me, Mr. Wycliffe, is what you actually did on the evening of the dispatch's arrival, not what you told Lestrade. What you did." Julian was quiet for a count of several seconds. Outside, the rain moved across the windows in a brief blurring gust. "I went to the muniment room," he said at last. "At around 11:30, I had the idea of, I do not know exactly, of looking at the papers, of seeing whether there was anything in there that might help my position." He looked at the floor. "I know how that sounds." "Go on," Holmes said. "The door was locked, obviously. I had no key and no means of obtaining one, and I stood there for perhaps 2 minutes feeling thoroughly ashamed of myself, and then I heard someone on the west staircase and I went back to my room." He looked up. "I did not touch anything. I did not enter the room. I did not intercept any dispatch. I considered doing something dishonest and I was too frightened, or perhaps too decent to see it through." He paused. "I am not entirely sure which." "The someone on the west staircase," Holmes said. "Did you see them?" "I heard them. A step and then the door at the bottom of the staircase. Someone was moving carefully. Using a candle, I thought, because there was a faint change in the light under the staircase door." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already placed in the correct position. He asked Julian whether he had spoken of this to anyone, and Julian said he had not, partly from shame and partly because admitting that he had been in the corridor at all would have placed him precisely where Lestrade needed him to be. When Julian had gone, I remarked that his account was consistent with the wax we had found on the west staircase step. "Entirely consistent," Holmes said. and his shame about the attempt is genuine enough. A man does not confess to contemplating a theft he actually committed. He confesses to contemplating it in order to explain his presence somewhere inconvenient, which is precisely what Julian has done. Holmes rose and moved to the window, where the rain was beginning to ease. He is guilty of weakness, Watson. Nothing more legally significant than that. It was at this point that Holmes did something I had not expected. He went to find Beatrice Vale. She was in the small upstairs sitting room, and when Holmes entered she looked at him with the wary attention of someone who has recently been given accurate information and is not yet certain of its consequences. Holmes sat across from her and said, quite gently, "Miss Vale, I know that you are aware of more than you have told us regarding Thursday evening. I am not asking you to incriminate yourself. I am asking you to tell me whether, in your knowledge or belief, Julian Wycliffe is responsible for the substitution of the dispatch." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "He is not." "You're certain?" "I am certain." She met Holmes's eyes steadily. "Julian is foolish, and he is desperate, but he is not the architect of what happened here. Whatever was done to that dispatch was done by someone with considerably more patience and considerably more to lose than Julian has." "And you know who that is," Holmes said. It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. She looked out of the window for a moment, and when she looked back her expression had the quality of someone who has made a decision they knew was coming, and have finally arrived at. "I have a strong belief," she said carefully. "I would not call it knowledge." "Then keep your belief for the present," Holmes said, rising. "I intend to replace it with evidence by tomorrow evening." He excused himself and came to find me in the corridor, and we went directly downstairs, where Holmes asked Pierce to arrange for a trap to be brought around within the hour. "The lodge?" I said. "The lodge." He took his coat from the stand and turned up the collar. "Lestrade will arrest Julian before nightfall if we do not move now. And I will not have an innocent man arrested for the convenience of someone else's plan." There was in his voice something that I could only describe as controlled anger, the quiet, purposeful variety that in Holmes always preceded the clearest and most effective of his actions. I put on my own coat and followed him out into the clearing rain. Chapter 8. The Emotional Contradiction. The road to Hartwell Lodge ran south-west from the Grange through a corridor of bare March hedgerow, the fields on either side reduced by the morning's rain to a dull pewter under a sky that had not quite decided whether it was finished with the day. Our driver, a local man engaged by Pierce, knew the road well enough but seemed uncertain of our destination until Holmes named the lodge specifically, at which point the man's shoulders settled into the particular neutrality of a person who has formed an opinion and elected not to share it. We covered the 4 miles in something under 30 minutes. I spent them watching the roadside and thinking about boots. It had been Holmes's remark about the courier's boots, made to Lestrade and left unretrieved since, that sat most persistently in my mind. Chalk dust on the uppers, Holmes had said, inconsistent with the Dorking Road, which runs through clay and gravel country. The chalk formation in this part of Surrey lies further south and west, toward the escarpment, in precisely the direction we were now travelling. The courier had not been delayed by bad roads near Dorking. He had been diverted before he reached Dorking, redirected along a different road entirely, to a property that lay at the edge of the chalk. I said as much to Holmes, who was watching the hedgerow with his hands resting on his knees. "You have been saving that," he said, with something approaching warmth. "I have been confirming it," I said. "There is a difference." He smiled briefly, which in the context of an active investigation was as generous an acknowledgment as he customarily offered. Hartwell Lodge presented itself as a low, square building of old brick, set behind a stand of oak and beech that had not yet come into leaf and therefore concealed it imperfectly, their bare branches providing a screen that was more suggestive than effective. A thin column of smoke rose from one of the chimneys. Holmes noticed it at the same moment I did, and said nothing, which was its own form of commentary. We descended from the trap, and Holmes instructed the driver to wait at the road. The path to the lodge door was flagged with pale stone, and even under the softening effect of recent rain I could see, pressed into the mud at the path's edge where it met the grass, the faint but legible impression of several sets of footprints. One set was heavier and wider than the rest, consistent with a man of substantial build in travelling boots. These prints led toward the door and didn't return by the same route, suggesting their maker had either left by another way or was still within. Holmes knocked at the door. There was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds, of the specific quality that indicates a silence being maintained rather than an absence. Then the door was opened by a heavy-set, weathered man of 50 or so, dressed in a working coat with the look of someone who has recently made an effort to appear occupied. He was, I understood immediately, the courier. The road was in his face and in his posture, in the way men carry their profession even when they are trying to set it aside. He looked at Holmes and then at me, and something in his expression passed through calculation and arrived at a guarded resignation. Holmes introduced us by name, stated that he was conducting an inquiry on behalf of the parties concerned, and asked whether we might come in. The man, whose name proved to be Gibbons, stood aside without either protest or welcome, and we entered a low-ceilinged sitting room where a fire was burning and the remains of a recent meal had not yet been cleared. Holmes sat down in the chair nearest the window, from which position he could observe both Gibbons and the door with equal ease, and he opened the conversation in the same unhurried manner with which he had addressed Preece, pleasantly, as though the situation were entirely comfortable, and with the particular quality of attention that makes people feel simultaneously at ease and very precisely seen. Gibbons confirmed his name, his engagement by the court as a dispatch courier, and his delivery of the sealed packet to Wycliffe Grange on Friday evening. He did this with the clipped brevity of a man reciting a prepared account, and Holmes allowed him to complete it before asking, without any alteration of tone, how long he had been staying at the lodge. A pause. "I've been resting here a few days. The road was tiring." 4 miles from where you made your delivery, Holmes said pleasantly. "It is a curious place to rest." "I know the Colonel. He offered the use of the place." "Before or after he met you on the road from London?" The pause this time was longer, and Gibbons used it to look at the fire rather than at Holmes. Holmes waited with the patience of a man who understands that silence, applied correctly, is considerably more persuasive than pressure. "He came to me at Leatherhead," Gibbons said at last, in the tone of a man releasing something heavy. "I was to stop for the horses. He was waiting at the inn. He said he was acting on behalf of the family and that the dispatch contained a private legal matter that the family wished to manage before it became a public record. He said I was to bring the packet to his lodge before continuing to the Grange, where he would ensure the matter was handled with the appropriate discretion." He used those words, the appropriate discretion. "And you agreed," Holmes said. "He said it was a legal arrangement, that the family had authority over the document's handling." Gibbons looked up. He spoke like a man who was accustomed to being believed, like it was settled business. "And at the lodge he exchanged your sealed packet for an identical one. He had it ready. He resealed it himself with a stamp and wax he had prepared. He said the contents had been duplicated for the family archive and that I was to deliver the copy to the house. He said that was standard procedure in cases of this kind." Gibbons paused. "I know it wasn't. I knew at the time, if I am honest. But he gave me a reason for everything, and the reasons were coherent enough that I let myself believe them." Holmes regarded him for a moment with an expression that contained neither judgment nor absolution, but simply a thorough and impersonal understanding. He asked whether Marlowe had used a specific phrase in explaining the necessity of the arrangement. Gibbons thought, "He said it was for the dignity of the house." Holmes looked at me, and I recognised in his expression the particular quality of a confirmation received that was expected and therefore afforded less satisfaction than it might otherwise have produced. We collected from Gibbons a written statement, which Holmes produced from an inside pocket in the form of a prepared document requiring only the addition of specific details and a signature, a preparation that Gibbons accepted with the slightly dazed expression of a man who is discovering that the interview was rather less improvised than it appeared. Holmes thanked him, told him with complete truthfulness that his cooperation at this stage would be weighed against his earlier compliance, and we returned to the trap. For the first half of the return journey neither of us spoke. The road unfolded before us through the stripped hedgerow, and the smoke of the lodge receded behind the stand of oak and beech until the pale sky absorbed it entirely. He prepared the false packet in advance, I said, before the dispatch had even arrived. He knew what it would contain. He had private legal correspondence, Holmes said. Preece was not the only solicitor consulted during the court's review. Marlowe had connection sufficient to obtain advance knowledge of the court's findings and sufficient organisation to prepare for them. He was quiet for a moment. The substitution was not a panicked response to bad news. It was planned weeks in advance. The planted envelope, the alteration of the household schedule, the courier's diversion, the instructions to leave and stay available nearby. All of it arranged with the deliberateness of a military operation. He paused. Which is, when one considers the Colonel's background, perhaps not entirely surprising. And the real dispatch, I said. It must be at the lodge. It is not at the lodge, Holmes said. I searched the sitting room while Gibbons was signing his statement, and you were kind enough to engage him in conversation about the road conditions. The dispatch is not there. Marlowe has it, and Marlowe is at the Grange. I turned this over. He would not destroy it. No, Holmes said, and his voice carried a note of something I can only call reluctant respect. A man who thinks of himself as acting from honour does not destroy legal documents. He suppresses them. He keeps them somewhere he can control them, because in his mind he is not a criminal. He is a custodian. Holmes looked at the road ahead. We will find it in his room, Watson, in something military, something locked, something he has carried through enough of his life to trust above all else. The Grange appeared through the trees at the end of the approach, its stone front pale and steady in the flat afternoon light, giving away nothing, as old houses seldom do, of the arrangements being made within it. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the interception. We returned to Wycliffe Grange at 3:15 to find Lestrade in the entrance hall with his coat on, his constable behind him, and the look of a man whose patience with alternative theories has reached its natural boundary. He informed Holmes, made his decision regarding Julian Wycliffe. The evidence was sufficient. The delay was no longer defensible, and he intended to speak with Julian that afternoon in terms that would make the seriousness of his position plain. He said this with the particular mixture of apology and determination that characterized his dealings with Holmes in those moments when professional obligation and personal doubt were in open competition with each other. Holmes said very calmly, "Give me this evening, Lestrade." "Holmes, I have given you 4 days." "You have given the investigation 4 days. I am asking for this evening specifically, because by the end of it you will have a case that will survive a court rather than merely satisfy a report." He held Lestrade's gaze with the steadiness of a man who is not appealing to sympathy, but to professional self-interest. "Julian Wycliffe is innocent, Lestrade. If you arrest him now, you will discover this publicly, which will be considerably less comfortable than discovering it here." Lestrade looked at him for a long moment. Then he removed his coat. "This evening," he said, "no longer." Holmes thanked him and went upstairs. I did not follow immediately. Instead, I remained in the entrance hall for a moment, listening to the house. There was a stillness about Wycliffe Grange that afternoon that was different in quality from the waiting stillness of the days before. That earlier stillness had been taut, anticipatory, the stillness of a string under tension. This was something heavier and more resigned, as though the house itself had arrived at reckoning it had been postponing and found the arrival less dramatic than the approach. Holmes reappeared at the top of the staircase 20 minutes later. He descended without haste, carrying nothing in his hands that had not been there when he went up. He asked Pierce to convene the household in the library at 5 o'clock and to inform Colonel Marlowe that his presence was particularly requested. His expression as he said this was neutral to the point of transparency, which in Holmes is not neutrality at all, but a very precise form of intent. By 5 the library was assembled. Lady Eleanor sat nearest the fire, composed in the manner of someone who has been composing herself since morning, and is beginning to feel the effort of it. Beatrice Vale sat to her left, slightly apart with the particular stillness I had come to associate with a person conserving their resources for what they know is coming. Julian occupied the sofa with Arthur beside him, both of them carrying the uneasy camaraderie of people thrown together by circumstances they would not have chosen. Mr. Priest stood near the writing desk with his hands clasped, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight. Lestrade and his constable positioned themselves near the door with the professional patience of men who have attended sufficient of these moments to know that their role is to wait. Colonel Marlowe sat in the high-backed chair to the right of the fireplace, as naturally and as assuredly as though he had selected it himself, which perhaps he had. He was in his customary state of composed authority, his large hands resting on the chair arms, his eyes on Holmes as Holmes moved to the centre of the room. Holmes stood with his hands clasped behind him and looked at the assembled faces for a moment before he began, in the manner of a man taking a precise measurement before committing a line to paper. The substitution of the court dispatch, he said, was not committed within this house. I want to establish that clearly because a great deal of effort has been expended, both by the criminal and by the investigation, on the question of who might have accessed the muniment room and removed the document from within it. The answer to that question is that no one did. The room was never breached. The seal was never broken inside this house. What Lady Eleanor locked away on Friday evening was not the court's dispatch. It was a forgery. The true document had been taken before it crossed this threshold. Julian let out a breath that was almost audible. Lady Ellen did not move. The courier, a man named Gibbons, was intercepted at Leatherhead before he turned south toward the Grange. He was met at the inn there by a man he knew, a man whose authority he trusted, a man who gave him a plausible explanation for what he was being asked to do and a sufficient reason to accept it. Holmes paused. That man told Gibbons that the family wished to manage the dispatch's contents privately before its formal presentation. He exchanged the sealed packet for a prepared forgery and instructed Gibbons to proceed to the Grange as though nothing had occurred. He used the phrase, twice according to Gibbons' account, that the arrangement was for the dignity of the house. The room was very quiet. The fire settled in the grate with a small sound of falling ash. The forged stamp was excellent work, Holmes continued, too excellent for improvisation. It had been prepared in advance, which means the criminal knew the dispatch's expected date of arrival, knew its contents with sufficient specificity to understand what he was suppressing, and had access to the materials of legal correspondence. Private legal correspondence, received through connections cultivated over decades in precisely the circles where such information moves. Holmes turned to face Colonel Marlowe directly for the first time. The chalk dust on the courier's boots placed him south of Dorking, on the road that passes within a quarter-mile of Hartwell Lodge. The phrase the courier reported, its precise diction, and its sentiment, belongs to a generation and a sensibility I think we can all identify without difficulty. The prepared forgery and the military dispatch box in which the true document is currently secured represent the working methods of a man trained in the management of sensitive materials and the maintenance of controlled information. Holmes paused. I visited Hartwell Lodge this morning, Colonel. I spoke at some length with Gibbons, who provided a written account of your conversation at Leatherhead, and I observed, while in the lodge, that the sitting room contained no document case of any kind, which told me that you had kept the dispatch with you here, in this house, because a man of your habits does not leave important material in an unsecured location. Marlowe had not moved. His face had undergone no dramatic alteration. What had changed over the course of Holmes's address was a quality of surface, the composed authority that he wore as naturally as his coat, and which was now simply not quite there any longer, like a light source that has been turned down rather than extinguished. Holmes looked at Pierce. If you would bring down the military dispatch box from Colonel Marlowe's room, Pierce. It is under the bed, toward the left side, and it is secured with a brass lock of the type used by the hussars. There was a silence of considerable length. Then Marlowe said, "No." He rose, and the room adjusted itself around the fact of his standing, the old instinct of people in the presence of a commanding figure. He did not look at Lestrade. He looked at Holmes. "You have done what you came to do," he said, and his voice was entirely steady. "I will not make it a performance." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a key on a plain ring. He held it for a moment, and then he set it on the mantelpiece with the deliberateness of a man concluding a long piece of work that has not ended as he intended. "I acted to protect this family," he said, addressing the room rather than any individual within it. "I acted to protect a name that Sir Reginald spent his life defending, and that deserved better than to be unmade by a court's administrative archaeology." He looked at Lady Eleanor, and in that look was something that I found, despite everything, not entirely without dignity. "I am sorry, Eleanor. I believed I was doing what Reginald would have wished." Lady Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "Reginald," she said at last very quietly, "spent the last year of his life trying to find a way to tell the truth." The silence that followed this was of a different order from any that had preceded it. Holmes said, without any particular weight, "Lestrade." Pierce went upstairs for the dispatch box, and Lestrade moved toward Marlowe, and the library at Wycliffe Grange, which had held its secrets with the patience of old wood and old paper, released them at last into the ordinary necessary light of Monday evening. Holmes stood at the window afterward, while the business of law proceeded behind him, and said nothing at all for a very long time. Chapter 10. The Name Restored. The House Changed. I have written elsewhere of the peculiar quality of silence that descends upon a household after a long concealment has been brought to its conclusion. It is not the silence of relief precisely, nor of grief, though it contains elements of both. It is closer, I think, to the silence that follows the removal of a piece of furniture that has occupied the same corner of a room for so long that its absence is at first more present than the object itself ever was. Wycliffe Grange had that quality on Tuesday morning, the particular hush of a house that has set something down and does not yet know what to do with its hands. Colonel Marlowe had been removed to the custody of Lestrade's constable the previous evening, and Lestrade himself had departed on the late train to London, carrying Gibbon's written statement, the dispatch box, its key, and the expression of a man who has arrived, by a more circuitous route than he would have preferred, at a satisfactory conclusion. He had shaken Holmes's hand at the door with a combination of professional acknowledgment and personal relief that was, in my observation, the sincerest form of gratitude Lestrade ever expressed. The true dispatch, recovered from the brass-locked military box that Pierce had brought down from Marlowe's room with the careful handling of a man who understands that he is carrying something whose weight is not entirely physical, had been placed in Priest's custody that same evening. Priest had examined it with his small lens, confirmed its authenticity through the seal, the paper, and the court's registered mark, and had locked it in his own case with the quiet satisfaction of a solicitor for whom the correct document in the correct place represents a form of moral order. Holmes and I were due to return to London on the morning train. We breakfasted early, in the smaller of the two dining rooms that the household used for informal occasions, and it was there that Lady Eleanor found us, arriving with the composed precision that I had come to understand was not coldness, but the hard-maintained form that had held her upright through a week of considerable strain. She sat down across from Holmes and placed her hands flat on the table, in the manner of someone who has decided to dispense with the ordinary framing of difficult conversations. "I owe you an honest account," she said, "of what I knew, and when I knew it." Holmes set down his cup. "You owe me nothing, Lady Eleanor. The law has what it requires. Nevertheless," she looked at him steadily, "I knew that Robert Marlowe had intervened. Not the specifics of how, but I had understood by Saturday morning that the substitution was his work. He came to me on Friday night, after the household had retired, and told me that he had ensured the dispatch could not produce a public scandal. He did not tell me what he had done. He told me only that he had acted, and that I should trust him, and that the matter would resolve itself in time. And you said nothing to us," Holmes said, without accusation. "I said nothing to anyone." She was quiet for a moment. He has been my husband's closest friend for 30 years. He sat with Reginald through the last weeks of his illness. He has been the most consistent presence in this household through everything that followed." She paused. "I am not offering these as justifications. I am offering them as the truth of why I hesitated, because you deserve the honest reason rather than a more flattering one." Holmes regarded her with the measured attention he had directed at her since her arrival in Baker Street. Seeing in her, I suspected, precisely what I saw, a woman of genuine intelligence and fundamental decency, who'd made a human error under pressure and was now accounting for it with more honesty than many people manage in more comfortable circumstances. "What will you do now?" he asked. She considered this seriously, as though it were a question she had not yet fully answered for herself. "Priest will submit the recovered dispatch to the court today. Whatever the formal process requires will be completed." She glanced toward the window, where the March morning was presenting itself with the cautious optimism of a season not yet committed to its own improvement. "Beatrice will remain at the Grange, not as a dependent relation, as what she is." She paused, and something in her expression shifted into territory that was new. "Reginald tried to tell me toward the end." He could not find the words that felt sufficient. I did not make it easier for him, I think, because I did not want to hear it. That is my particular share of this, Mr. Holmes, and I intend to carry it honestly. Holmes said nothing in response to this, which was, I thought, the most respectful thing he could have done. We took our leave of the household an hour later. Arthur Wickliffe shook my hand in the entrance hall with the directness that had characterised him throughout, and said he intended to return abroad within the fortnight, a piece of information he conveyed without apology and without particular sadness, as a man states a geographical fact. Julian, who had the slightly dazed appearance of someone who has been very close to a falling object, and is still adjusting to the fact that it missed him, thanked Holmes with a warmth that Holmes received with polite economy, and immediately redirected toward the practical suggestion that Julian attend to his creditors before attending to anything else. Beatrice Vale walked with us to the door. She had about her that morning a quality I had not previously observed, a quality that was not happiness exactly, because the situation contained too much complexity and too much unresolved history for simple happiness to be quite the right instrument, but something more durable, the quality of a person who has been standing on uncertain ground for a very long time and has felt it, at last, become solid beneath them. She shook Holmes's hand and then mine, and to Holmes she said only, "Thank you for not making it more than it needed to be." Holmes looked at her for a moment. "The law tends toward the declarative," he said. "You needed the facts established. You did not need a performance." She smiled, which altered her face considerably and agreeably, and went back inside. The trap carried us to the station through a Surrey morning that had definitively decided sometime in the preceding hour to become spring. The hedgerows showed the first faint insistence of green at their lower edges, and the light falling across the fields had lost the flat pewter of the preceding days and taken on instead the tentative gold of a season beginning to believe in itself. Holmes sat across from me with his coat open and his hat pushed slightly back, and he was not reading, and he was not reasoning, or at least not in the focused instrumental way of the preceding week. He was simply present, in the way that he sometimes was at the conclusion of a case that had required something beyond the merely intellectual, when the human elements had been considerable enough to leave their mark even on a temperament as disciplined as his. At the station, while we waited for the London train, I asked him what he made of Marlowe in the final account. He was quiet for a moment, watching a porter move a luggage trolley along the platform with the unhurried competence of a man entirely comfortable with his work. "Marlowe is a man who loved an idea more than he loved a person," Holmes said at last. The idea was the Wickliffe name, its continuity, its dignity, what he understood as its honour. The person, in this case, was Beatrice Vale, whom he has known since her childhood, and whose legitimate existence he spent 30 years quietly helping to suppress, not from cruelty, but from a certainty so complete that it never occurred to him to question it. He turned from the porter. That is the most dangerous kind of wrong, Watson, the kind that feels, to its author, indistinguishable from right. The train arrived in a long, deliberate exhalation of steam. We found our carriage and settled into our respective corners, and the Surrey countryside began to move past the windows at its steady, unhurried pace. I thought of the Grange behind us, of its stone front releasing no expression to the morning, of the muniment room with its disturbed dust and its scratched lock, of the slow corridor clock that had marked the passage of a week in which small wrongnesses had accumulated, one by one, into something large enough to require the full attention of the most singular mind I have ever had the privilege to know. I thought of Beatrice Vale standing at the door, and of Lady Eleanor at the breakfast table with her hands flat on the cloth, and of a key set upon a mantelpiece by a man who had been wrong in the most human of ways. Holmes had already closed his eyes. His face in repose had the quality, not of vacancy, but of a machine returned briefly to stillness, gathering itself with complete efficiency for whatever came next. I opened my notebook and began, as I've always begun, from the beginning. Some cases conclude with an arrest, with the clean administrative satisfaction of law applied to fact, and that is sufficient and right. But the cases that remain with me longest are those in which the law's conclusion is only the outermost layer of a resolution that goes considerably deeper, where the truth that matters most is not the one delivered to the court, but the one that settles quietly into the lives of the people it has always concerned, finding there, in its own time and on its own terms, a place to rest. The train carried us north toward London, and the morning widened over the fields, and I wrote in the knowledge that what I was recording was not only a crime solved, but a family, altered, beginning in its altered state to find its proper shape,